On the afternoon of May 31st, 1916, a British battleship was sailing in circles. Not tactically, not deliberately. Her steering was destroyed, her helm was jammed hard to port by a German shell, and she was rotating helplessly in the middle of the Battle of Jutland, while the guns of the Imperial German High Seas Fleet found their range. She had already absorbed 13 heavy-caliber hits. Her deck was on fire. Her crew was managing flooding in multiple compartments simultaneously. By every operational assessment available to the officers watching her from other ships in the fleet, she was finished. They were waiting for her to go under. She did not go under. She killed 2 German cruisers on her way out of the battle, limped back to port under her own power, and returned to active service. That was 1916. She had 28 more years of war ahead of her. The HMS Warspite, the most decorated warship in the history of the Royal Navy. A ship that fought in the First World War, survived it, was modernized, and went back to war in 1939 to fight again at Narvik, at Calabria, at Cape Matapan, at Crete, at Salerno, and at Normandy. A ship that was hit by shells, by bombs, by torpedoes, and by one of the first precision-guided weapons in the history of aerial warfare. A ship that was written off by her own admiralty multiple times, and that kept returning to the line. A ship that, when she was finally sold for scrapping in 1947, after 34 years of service, ran aground on the Cornish coast while being towed to the breakers, as if declining one final time to go where the bureaucrats had decided she should go. The popular history of the Warspite is a romance. It frames her survival across 4 conflicts as a function of spirit, of luck, of the ship's legendary fighting qualities, given almost human character by her crews and admirers. That framing is understandable. It is also insufficient. The Warspite's story, when you read the damage reports and the repair records and the operational assessments, rather than the regimental histories, is not a story about luck. It is a story about the structural philosophy embedded in her Queen Elizabeth-class design, about the decisions made by her damage control crews under fire, and about a sequence of operational circumstances in which the margin between survival and loss was measured in minutes, in flooding rates, and in the physical endurance of men fighting fires and shoring bulkheads in spaces that were designed to contain exactly the kind of damage she was absorbing. The Warspite did not survive by being lucky. She survived because she was built with enough structural redundancy to absorb punishment that would have finished lesser ships, and because the men aboard her consistently made the right decisions under conditions that did not allow for second chances. To understand what made the Warspite structurally exceptional, you have to understand what made the Queen Elizabeth class different from what came before. Laid down in 1912 and 1913, the Queen Elizabeth battleships were designed around a central concept that represented a genuine departure from previous British capital ship philosophy. They were fast battleships, capable of 25 knots, faster than any previous British battleship, armed with the new 15-inch gun that fired a 1,920-pound shell, and protected by armor that prioritized the protection of the main machinery spaces and magazines over comprehensive coverage. The armor scheme was not perfect. No armor scheme is. But the underwater protection system, the layered void and liquid-filled compartments designed to absorb torpedo and mine damage before it reached the ship's vitals, was advanced for its era and provided a degree of resilience that the Warspite's career would demonstrate repeatedly. Jutland in May 1916 was the first test, and it nearly ended the experiment before the ship's story had properly begun. The Warspite's steering casualty was the result of a shell hit that damaged her helm machinery at a critical moment in the battle's geometry, and the resulting uncontrolled turn brought her directly toward the German line at close range. She absorbed 13 heavy-caliber shells in the space of a few minutes. The damage was extensive. Her upper decks were wrecked. Fires were burning in multiple compartments. Flooding was significant. The fact that she survived was not solely attributable to the Queen Elizabeth armor scheme. It was also a function of the accuracy, or lack thereof, of German gunnery at close range against a fast-moving target, executing an involuntary turn that made her a genuinely difficult firing solution, despite her apparent vulnerability. But structural factors mattered. The armor protecting her magazines held. Her engine rooms were not penetrated. The flooding, though serious, was contained within the compartmentation system sufficiently to prevent progressive flooding. She reached Rosyth under her own power. She was back in service in time for subsequent operations. The 13 hits at Jutland produced damage that was repaired in weeks. A less well-built ship would have been repaired at the bottom of the North Sea. The interwar period transformed the Warspite twice. She underwent extensive modernizations in the 1920s and again in the mid-1930s, the second modernization being one of the most comprehensive reconstructions ever applied to a Royal Navy capital ship. Her superstructure was rebuilt. Her anti-aircraft armament was significantly enhanced. Her machinery was replaced to improve reliability. Her underwater protection was updated. She emerged from her 1937 refit as a substantially different ship from the one that had circled helplessly at Jutland, though with the same 15-inch guns, the same basic hull, and the same structural philosophy embedded in her keel and frames. This reconstruction is sometimes treated as a footnote in the Warspite's narrative, but it matters operationally. The ship that went to war in 1939 was not a 30-year-old design running on original specifications. She was a heavily modernized warship with systems updated to contemporary standards, and those updates influenced her survivability in ways the romantic version of her story tends to obscure. The Norwegian campaign of April 1940 gave the Warspite her first action of the Second World War and produced one of the most operationally one-sided engagements of the entire conflict. At the Second Battle of Narvik on April 13, 1940, the Warspite led 9 destroyers up the Ofotfjord against 8 German destroyers that had been trapped in the fjord after the first battle 2 days earlier. The German ships were in a tactically impossible position. Their fuel was nearly exhausted, their ammunition was limited after the first engagement, and they faced an opponent that outgunned them so comprehensively that the outcome was never in question. The Warspite's 15-inch guns, operating in the confined waters of the fjord, reduced the German force to wreckage. What is operationally interesting about Narvik is not the tactical result, which was predetermined, but the operational decision to use a battleship in confined fjord waters, where the navigational risks were significant and where air threat, though not realized in this instance, was a genuine concern. The decision reflected an aggressive command philosophy that the Warspite's subsequent career would demonstrate repeatedly, a willingness to accept operational risk in exchange for decisive results. The Mediterranean in 1940 and 1941 was where the Warspite's second war reached its operational peak and where the ship absorbed the first of the serious damage that would accumulate across her wartime service. At the Battle of Calabria in July 1940, the Warspite achieved what remains the longest recorded gunnery hit in naval history, a 15-inch shell that struck the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare at a range of approximately 26,000 yards, nearly 15 miles. The hit caused significant damage and smoke that forced the Italian fleet to break off the engagement. The operational significance of the hit was that it demonstrated the effective range of the 15-inch gun against a maneuvering target in realistic sea conditions, and it established a range boundary for Italian surface forces that influenced their tactical calculations throughout the Mediterranean campaign. The Giulio Cesare survived. The psychological effect on Italian naval command did not. Cape Matapan in March 1941 was the Warspite's most operationally complete engagement of the war. Acting on intelligence derived from code-breaking, the Mediterranean fleet intercepted an Italian force that included the heavy cruisers Zara and Pola and the battleship Vittorio Veneto. The Warspite, with her sister ships Barham and Valiant, caught the Italian cruisers at night at close range. The engagement was brief and one-sided. The Zara and Pola were sunk. The Vittorio Veneto escaped with torpedo damage. For the Warspite, Matapan was operationally clean. She absorbed no significant damage and delivered her firepower effectively. It was among the last engagements of the Mediterranean campaign that would go that smoothly. The Battle of Crete in May 1941 was the Mediterranean fleet's worst experience of the war, and the Warspite's worst experience of the campaign. The German air offensive against the fleet supporting the Crete evacuation was sustained, professional, and effective in a way that the fleet's anti-aircraft capability was not yet equipped to counter. The Warspite was hit by 3 bombs during the Crete operations. The damage was serious. Her forward gun turrets were disabled. She took flooding casualties. She required repairs extensive enough to take her to the United States for dry docking, the only facility capable of handling the scope of the work in the available time frame. She was out of the Mediterranean for months. The Crete damage assessment, read as a pure document without the narrative framing of the ship's reputation, describes a warship that had been punished to the edge of its structural tolerance by aerial attack. The fact that she reached Alexandria under her own power after the Crete hits was a function of flooding control, structural redundancy, and crew performance, not of any mythological invincibility. The Fritz X attack in September 1943 was the moment that came closest to ending the Warspite permanently. The Fritz X was a German radio-controlled glide bomb, one of the first precision-guided weapons employed in combat, and it was deployed against Allied shipping off Salerno during the Italian landings. The Warspite was hit by a single Fritz X on September 16, 1943. The weapon penetrated her deck armor, passed through multiple decks, and detonated near the bottom of the ship. The explosion blew out the double bottom, flooded the boiler rooms, and left her dead in the water. She took on approximately 5,000 tons of water. Her main machinery was disabled. She was towed first to Malta and then to Gibraltar, and subsequently to the United States again for the second major repair of her wartime career. The Fritz X hit should, by any reasonable damage assessment, have ended her operational life. 6 of her 9 boiler rooms were flooded. Her structural integrity was severely compromised. She was an elderly vessel that had already absorbed decades of service and multiple significant damage incidents. The repair cost and timeline were substantial. The decision to repair rather than scrap was not an automatic one, but she was repaired. And in June 1944, the HMS Warspite, operating with reduced propulsion capacity, unable to make her design speed, carrying structural repairs that were functional but not fully restored to original specification, took position off the Normandy beaches and bombarded German positions in support of the D-Day landings. Her 15-inch guns, the same guns she had carried since 1915, fired on targets in France that the German defenders had not expected to be within range of naval gunfire. The Warspite's contribution to the D-Day bombardment was not ceremonial. The 15-inch gun's shell weight and range provided a level of fire support that lighter naval vessels could not replicate, and the accuracy of the Warspite's fire, directed by observers ashore, was credited with destroying specific German strongpoints that would otherwise have required ground assault. She was finally retired from service in 1945 and sold for scrapping in 1947. The tow to the Breakers Yard in Scotland encountered severe weather in the English Channel, and the Warspite broke free of her tow lines. She drifted into Mounts Bay in Cornwall and grounded at Prussia Cove. The grounding was not dramatic. It was not the result of enemy action or structural failure or human error on the part of the salvage crew. It was weather and chance and the particular geography of the Cornish coast. The romantic interpretation that has attached itself to the grounding, the old ship refusing to go to the breakers, choosing her own resting place, is understandable as a literary sentiment and irrelevant as an operational assessment. What is not irrelevant is the operational record that preceded that grounding. 13 shell hits at Jutland, bomb hits at Crete, the Fritz X penetration at Salerno. A campaign record spanning 3 decades and 4 distinct conflict theaters. A damage history that would have sunk multiple lesser ships, and that the Warspite absorbed, was repaired from, and returned to service from, repeatedly. The lesson the operational data extracts from the Warspite's career is not mystical. It is structural and doctrinal. She survived because she was built with enough redundancy to contain damage that was not supposed to be survivable. She was repaired and returned to service because the Royal Navy, across multiple administrations and multiple strategic contexts, calculated that her combat capability was worth the repair cost. And she kept being capable because the men who crewed her, in flooding boiler rooms and burning gun compartments and dead-in-the-water machinery spaces off the Italian coast, performed damage control to a standard that preserved enough of the ship to give the repair crews something to work with. The romance is a reasonable response to an extraordinary operational record, but the operational record is more interesting than the romance, and it is built on decisions made by engineers and damage control parties and naval administrators, rather than by the ship's legendary fighting spirit. The spirit is a story people tell about a ship. The damage reports are what actually happened.